Local programming on KRWG made possible by viewers like you. Thank you. Chamber funding from the Las Cruces Sun News, the Las Cruces Bulletin, Comcast, Sapphire Energy, and Home Instead Senior Care. Thanks so much for joining us for the Chamber Economic Forum. I'm Fred Martino. We have with us, as usual, Dr. Jim Peach with a look at the national picture, and also joining us, Dr. Chris Erickson. He will have a look at our regional economy. And Dr. Ken Martin, not with us today, but we do hope to have him back at our next Chamber Economic Forum. We're going to get to audience questions coming up, but first, as we always do during our Chamber Forums, we have a chance to hear from our economist from NMSU talking about the state of the economy, both across the country and locally. Let's start with the national picture and Dr. Peach.
Thank you, Fred, and thanks to KRWG and the Chamber for sponsoring these. Excuse me, the national economy, we're in the midst of a very weak recovery from the Great Recession that started in December 2007. We have had 14 quarters of positive real GDP growth. We have had 30 straight months of growth in non-farm payroll employment. Those are both good things. But the growth is obviously very, very weak. The average growth rate of the quarterly GDP number over the last 14 quarters has been 2.1%. Far below the long-run trend of 3.3%, and much, much lower than recoveries in previous recessions. The employment growth has averaged over the last 30 months 175,000 jobs per month. Over the last 12 months, it's fallen a little bit to about 160,000 jobs. That leaves us still, we're 2.9 million jobs fewer today than we had in December '07 when the recession began. It'll take us somewhere in early 2015 before we will have as many jobs as we did in 2007. So the recovery is not a strong one. There are some positive signs. There are some really positive signs. Automobile sales this year, auto and light truck sales, are likely to reach 15.5 million, maybe even a little bit more, after falling from 16 million in 2007 to 10.5 million in 2009. So the automobile industry is recovering nicely. Housing is beginning to pick up. New single-family housing starts in the first 3 months of this year averaged 630,000. That's 150,000 more than the same 3-month period a year ago, and far more than the low point of 350,000 in 2009. So housing is beginning to pick up. The Case-Shiller Home Price Index that was released just a few weeks ago indicates that year over year, January to January, housing prices in their 20-city index increased by 8.1%. It is the strongest increase we've had since the beginning of the recession. Still leaves housing prices a little bit lower than they were in 2007, quite a bit lower, but a very healthy sign, and all 20 cities showed positive increases year over year in housing prices. So where do we go from here? There is more or less a consensus among forecasters, fortune tellers, and econometricians that we'll have real GDP growth of about 2% this year. And the logic, I wish I could contradict that and provide you with a much higher forecast, but the logic behind that is pretty solid, and they're all saying the same thing no matter where we go. To private sector forecasters, to government forecasters, the logic is simple. The negative effects of the sequester, the cuts in the federal budget, and the increase in the payroll tax are not enough to really send us back into a recession. They are not big enough even to dominate the increases in housing, in automobile sales, and in other consumer purchases. So we'll end up with some modest rate of growth of GDP of about 2%. Tomorrow they're going to release the first quarter estimate, and there's a GDP for 2013, and there are a variety of forecasts out there from 2% to 3%, with most forecasters leaning towards a really good solid first quarter after a very weak quarter in the last quarter of 2012, where we only had 0.4% growth. In addition to that, they do point out to sort of a decrease in worries about the Eurozone. The Euro problem is still with us, but nobody is arguing that Cyprus is going to bring down the U.S. economy. It's just not at the crisis stage that it used to be. The things that are kind of hanging over that forecast, of course, are we've gotten over the immediate budget problems, but we still have not finalized an FY14 budget, a fiscal year 14 budget. And if that's fairly austere, you might lower growth a little bit. The fiscal year starts October 1 and could affect the last quarter. Commodity prices are relatively stable. No one is forecasting a spike in oil prices. No one is forecasting spikes in any of the major commodities. Natural gas prices are up a little bit, and that's probably a good thing. Last year, natural gas averaged about 3.25 per thousand cubic feet, and that was not enough to get people really drilling again. A little bit higher price on natural gas could spur some drilling activity nationwide. The figure that people in the industry throw out is $5 per MCF. We're not quite there yet. But no one is really worried about commodity prices. Copper is $3.25 a pound, and that's plenty for copper producers to mine and make some money, but it's not anything that will kill off, say, the construction industry that uses a lot of copper and wiring. I'm more concerned about long-run growth. The long-run growth of the U.S. economy was absolutely remarkable in the 20th century. We averaged real GDP growth of 3.3% a year. We're much less than that. We need at least that. We need some short-term stuff that's 4.5 or 5%, which is not unusual in a recovery. And we're not talking about the issues that really, in the national debate, that really contribute to long-run economic growth. And there is no mystery about the things that contributed to the success of the U.S. economy in the 20th century. We had, for most of the 20th century, the most educated and highly trained workforce in the world. We had the healthiest workforce in the world. We invested a lot in infrastructure, especially transportation infrastructure, and for most of the 20th century, we had the best transportation system in the world. We had cheap energy. We invested a lot in research and development and technological change. Those are the factors that created economic growth in the 20th century. Those things are not in dispute. You will notice the absence there of any item relating to the debt or the deficit or all of the silliness that we're now engaged in debating those kinds of issues. The debt and the deficit are simply not issues related to long-term economic growth and the strength of the economy. There are urban myths out there that suggest otherwise, but the analytics of it don't suggest much of a relationship between deficits and long-term economic growth. They don't suggests that we have a debt problem. Maybe that'll spark a few questions from the audience, but it's absolute silliness. We ought to be discussing the things that really make the economy grow in the long run, and we're not doing that at the national level.
Okay, so there's the national picture, and perhaps as well a chance for our audience to think about some questions with that prescription for the future. Now let's get a look at the local picture, the regional picture from Dr. Erickson.
Yeah. Thanks to KRWG and thanks to the Chamber for having us here. I always like following Jim because you're always so mild and uncontroversial. And so what I'd like to do is kind of take a two-pronged approach to my presentation on the local economy this time. And one, I'd like to talk about what's going on currently, which is not that good. We are in a recession in Las Cruces. We are perhaps at the end of the recession statewide, but we're coming out of a recession statewide. Albuquerque has seen job losses, and that's turned around in the last couple of months, but still it's a very weak economy both statewide and locally. Las Cruces in the year ended in March has the employment in our city has declined by 0.9%. And that's non-farm jobs. Statewide, it increased by 0.5%, very slow growth, and that compares to a national figure of 1.4%. So what we're seeing is that we are in a recession in our city. The state is growing very, very slowly, and we're not keeping up with the weak recovery that Jim so eloquently described at the national level. If you look back to the start of the Great Recession is dated as having started in December of 2007. So we're at a just past 5-year mark on when that recession began. And if you look back at those numbers, you see that Las Cruces actually has done pretty well. We are down 0.3% in employment since the beginning of the Great Recession. Now, if you think about that math for a little bit, that means that every job that we've lost in the last 5 years, we lost last year and then some. So if you took off last year, we actually had positive employment growth since the beginning of the recession, but last year was a poor year for our community. And then also, statewide, the jobs are down 5.2%, and nationally it's down 2.4%. So our state is down about twice the national average right now, and that reflects, and that came in the last couple of years because of the slow growth statewide. Turning to income for a moment, Las Cruces continues to struggle trying to keep up with income. Income in Las Cruces is about 70% of the national average. Among the 365 metropolitan statistical areas, we rank 26th from the bottom, just 26th from the bottom out of 365 communities. In terms of income growth, again, we saw adjusting for inflation, we saw a decline in income in our city on per capita basis last year, although since the start of the recession, we're up about 3.4% adjusted for inflation. Now 3.4%, that is a positive number, but 3.4% increase over 5 years is less than 1% a year. That's a very slow growth. Real estate markets, Jim mentioned that real estate markets have recovered nationally. We can't say the same thing about here locally. In the last year, housing prices have declined by 2.4%. According to the Federal Housing Agency, and nationally they were up 0.4%, and that's year over year for the fourth quarter of last year. Since the start of the recession, since 2007, housing prices in Las Cruces are down 16% compared to a national number of 15%. So we're not doing that much worse than the national number, but we are actually doing a little bit worse than we are nationally. And again, if you took out last year, it would be true that Las Cruces housing prices had been doing better than the national average up until then. So you can see that this recession we've been in locally has taken its toll on real estate market. What exactly is causing us to slow down our local economy, and I think you can point to one thing, and that is government spending. Las Cruces, New Mexico in general, are heavily dependent on federal spending. The sequester is hitting us disproportionately hard because of that. And you also have remember, the sequester affects military spending, such as you have out at White Sands and at Fort Bliss, disproportionately to non-military spending. And then also we have the national labs that are adversely affected by the slowdown in federal spending and by the sequester. Now, a few weeks ago, you saw a fair amount of positive press that said that New Mexico had done pretty well in the budget proposed by the Obama administration. And I think that's true. If the Obama administration budget were to be passed, we'd see slight growth, I think, at Los Alamos, and be flat, basically, in federal spending otherwise. And that would be good. But when was the last time Congress passed a president's budget? The budget in place now, the law in place right now, assumes continuing sequester, continuing slowdown in federal spending, and I personally don't think there's much chance of there being a turnaround in Washington, D.C. that's going to positively affect us. And it's interesting, Jim, that you mentioned the things that would contribute to long-term economic growth, because I have that listed on my notes for what to talk about today too. And there's no question that in this community, the thing that would contribute the most to long-term growth would be improvement in K-12 education. Now, that would have a long-term benefit because it would mean that our children would be better educated, better able to get jobs, better able to create businesses, better able to employ their fellow citizens. So that would be one advantage of K-12 education, and that's a long-term benefit. But another benefit of K-12 education is that people who want to locate to a community want to locate to a community where there are good schools that can educate their children. And right now, I don't know if you can really say that about Las Cruces. We don't have terrible schools. There's worse schools, but we don't have schools that have the quality and the high graduation rates that we can really point to of pride and use as a tool for attracting employers to our community. My wife is a school teacher. She teaches science in Oñate, so I'm probably getting in trouble for saying what I just said, but still I think that that's the biggest issue facing us, both short run and long run, is improving K-12.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Erickson. And we will ask our audience members now to come to the microphone. And while they do come to the microphone for their questions, a new report was issued this week by the Pew Research Center that may frame part of our remaining discussion. This has been a very uneven recovery for most Americans. The bottom 93% net worth has fallen, and it averaged less than $134,000 in 2011. Meantime, the top 7% of Americans have seen their net worth skyrocket by 28% to more than $3.1 million in 2011, driven, of course, in part by stock market gains. Our next graphic shows the effect of this. The top 7% of Americans had 63% of the aggregate wealth in 2011. That is up significantly from 56% in 2009. Again, 7% of the population with 63% of our nation's wealth. Some interesting figures from the Pew Research Center. And our first question now from an audience member. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. A question for Dr. Peach. We read every day, and it almost changes, about quantitative easing and the impact that they're going to stop it, and then the next day you read they're going to need to continue it. My question to you is, when they finally do discontinue the Fed quantitative easing, what will be the impact relative to interest rates and inflation?
Well, first, I'm not convinced they're going to end it anytime soon. Chairman Bernanke is not talking like that. Some members of the Federal Open Market Committee are discussing that. At some point, they're going to get out of the business of QE. They're currently buying about $85 billion a month and deliberately trying to keep interest rates low, and in particular, they're trying to keep the 10-year rate low. When they back off of that, clearly, interest rates are going to go up a little bit. There's no sign that that's going to happen this year or next. And the Fed really has one major tool for affecting the economy, and that is interest rates. They used to target the money supply. They don't do that anymore. They target interest rates. Interest rates on the low end are not really much of a stimulus. Business invests with the expectation of making money. I don't care how low the interest rate goes. If there's no anticipation of making money, if there's no aggregate demand out there, businesses are not going to invest. So the Fed has a real problem, and it may be part of the reason why Ben Bernanke is talking about not even asking for another term, and his term will be over early next year. He may not want to face the end of QE3, and I don't blame him a bit. That's going to be a tricky thing to get out of.
Yeah, if I could add a little bit. QE3 is, well, first of all, the situation the Fed is in right today is unprecedented. We have never been in a situation like this with the amount of massive excess reserves are being held by the banking system, and with the very large and engorged, you might say, balance sheet of the Federal Reserve that has resulted from QE 1, 2, and 3. And I agree with Jim that the end of QE3 is not likely for, I think I saw a report that Solomon Brothers is saying 14 months before the end of QE3, and I think that's a reasonable guess, something like that. And the issue I have is, will they be able to move out of this situation without igniting inflation? They think they can, and the way that they're thinking they're going to do this, you read, is by manipulating the interest rates they pay banks so that banks will have an incentive to keep excess reserves rather than lend them out and cause inflation. But we don't know if that'll work because we've never been here before. We don't know if we can prevent inflation from happening. Then another question you can ask, and Jim pointed this out, is that maybe a little inflation might not be bad. Because if you have inflation, that means that the nominal interest rate is 0, and you have inflation, that puts the real interest rate, you can reduce the real interest rate that way. And a little bit of inflation, say 15% over 3 or 4 years, would do a lot to help the housing market to recover, to help a lot of people get out from under water on their mortgages, and it might do a lot to improve the economy.
You know, I often hear that, Dr. Erickson, but it's a terrifying thought to me because, and I would imagine to both of you as well, we work for New Mexico State University, and there are many people in terms of our country, in terms of our state especially, who work for state, federal, or local governments. And even in the current situation with inflation that is at 2% about, a 1% raise doesn't even keep up with inflation. It's actually not keeping up with it. So this, if this were to happen, what you're describing, for our local economy, I would imagine that this would be very, very hard for our local economy because the raises aren't there. They're not keeping up with inflation even now.
Yeah. If the legislature were to continue a policy of not keeping up with inflation, it would be a very difficult situation. But I think even the legislature, if they saw 15% inflation over a couple of years, would realize that they would need to raise wages. And by the way, tax revenues would go up too, because sales tax, of course, is proportional to the price. And so inflation increases sales tax revenue.
Okay. Let me chime in on that for a second. You may worry about inflation. My colleague Chris Erickson may worry about inflation. There is no reason to worry about inflation when we have such tremendous slack in the economy. None whatsoever. Central bankers, Ben Bernanke, they're born with a fear of inflation. Some of us are afraid of heights, some of us are afraid of water, but those guys, all of them, come out of the same factory in New Jersey, and the requirement is that they are afraid of inflation, whether there's any danger of it or not. Okay, now, there is no possibility of any serious inflation in this economy as long as we have such extra capacity, both in the labor market and in the industrial system and anywhere you look. You can't drive prices up with that kind of slack capacity and make it last for any length of time. Let's worry about, besides, we do have tools. The central bank, the Federal Reserve System, does know how to stop inflation. That's the last thing we ought to be worrying about.
Okay. Well, I guess
he'll disagree. That's all right.
Well, and I'll be right. But
not a chance.
But
he was right once in 1986.
Yeah. But I do agree that the chances of inflation short run are very modest. So we're talking more like towards the end of the decade when we talk about inflation picking up. Okay. So it's after we're in full recovery. And we're and can the Fed back off this huge supply of excess reserves without inflation? I'm not sure they can. I think they can, but I'm not sure they can.
All right, we have another question.
That's fun.
My question is, in the long run in the economy, we've seen President Peña Nieto talk about the open up of Pemex energy sector. That will create a major impact for the U.S. energy sector. I believe, and the immigration reform that's being discussed right now, especially in the regional economy, would have an impact, I guess. So I would really like to know what your thoughts are on those topics.
All right. Okay. So you've asked two questions there, if I can. One is the energy sector, and in particular, the possibility of opening up Mexico and letting and Pemex being more market-oriented and letting foreign companies come in for exploration, distribution, and refining is a possibility that has been discussed in Mexico for several decades now. Mexico has a lot of oil. Mexico has had trouble producing and delivering that oil in the last 10 years. In fact, production has declined. It's not because you're running out of oil. The U.S. really imports very little oil from Mexico, and we are increasing production domestically. I think it would be good for both countries if Pemex opened up. I think it would be especially good for Mexico because you could produce more and export it not only to the United States but around the world. Much less supply a very rapidly growing domestic demand for petroleum and natural gas and electricity. The immigration issue we could spend the rest of the decade on, and we may. Clearly, our immigration system is broken. The last major immigration legislation was the Immigration Reform and Control Act that went into effect in 1987, which for the first time made it illegal for employers to hire someone who was not documented to work in the United States. That, of course, has never been seriously enforced. It's been, the large organizations have always followed the law because they can't afford not to. They're easy targets. Big corporations, the university tries to follow that. But for the most part, we haven't ever enforced that. The Pew Foundation estimates are that we now have 12 million people in the United States who are undocumented, about 35 or 40% of those from Mexico. We're certainly not going to go back to the days of the early 1950s when we tried to round up undocumented persons in the United States forcefully and send them forcibly back to some other nation. We're not going to do that. So we've got to find a way to deal with those 12 million people, more or less. Might be 10, might be 14. We don't really know. And that's the issue. That's the real issue there. Whether or not we tie immigration policy to labor market conditions in the United States and let more migrants in when the unemployment rate is low, have fewer migrants when the unemployment rate is high, I don't know. It's going to be a tough deal.
Okay, we look forward to our next question from an audience member, and we do have that available for us right coming up here as we adjust that microphone. We want to get it right. You want to be able to hear the individual with their question. And thanks for asking it.
Sure. My question is basically you've recounted the economy and its lack of strength here in the local area. And my question is, looking forward with no grand bargain on the horizon inside of D.C. and the sequestration kind of grinding on, what do you see locally for the next 24 months?
Yeah, well, I'm among the most pessimistic people who has ventured to make a forecast on the local economy. And I have predicted, and I'm out on the limb on this, I'm further out than anybody else, but that I know of. There may be someone else out there I haven't read. But I think that New Mexico will lose 28,000 jobs as a consequence of the total fiscal cliff. That includes the increase in taxes on payroll taxes, the increase in taxes at the high end of the income spectrum, and most importantly, the decline in federal spending on programs in energy and military. For example, here in Doña Ana County, a number of years ago I did a study where I estimated that 25% of our local economy, direct and indirect, depends on defense spending. And so when defense spending goes down, that has a significant impact on our local economy as a consequence. Now that study's a little bit out of date. I don't know if those numbers are still correct, but it's in the ballpark. It's something like a quarter of our economy.
So your 28,000 jobs in the state of New Mexico, though,
right,
that is based on the idea that Congress will not reverse some of these sequestration cuts. Because if some of them were reversed, then the number would go down.
Absolutely, that is correct. And in particular, it's based on the assumption that cuts will happen in the Department of Energy, and those cuts will be approximately the same across the country. New Mexico, I believe, is sixth most dependent on a per capita basis on defense spending of any state. I believe that's correct. And that gives us and so of course we're going to have a disproportional impact. Now it is possible that when all is said and done, for one reason or another, federal cuts in New Mexico won't be proportional, but I think they will be close to proportional.
Okay. Well, as we wait for our next audience question, I have to ask you this, Dr. Erickson. The question is, we're all talking here about federal policy, but there has been a change in state policy. Of course, the state legislature approved at the end of the session a cut in corporate taxes, state corporate taxes. Some people say this could increase jobs in New Mexico. Others disagree. They say that it won't make much of a difference, if any difference.
I don't think it'll make much of a difference in terms of being a tax cut. I am strongly opposed to corporate income tax at both the federal and the state level, but for a reason different than most people are. Most people say, well, it'll stimulate jobs, and it might stimulate jobs a little bit. But I think the real important reason is because the corporate tax is an excuse for corporations to lobby in state capital, in the federal capital, for breaks on their corporate taxes. There's a lot of effort put into lobbying that is essentially wasted. It's just trying to take the tax burden off of one group of people and put it on another group of people.
And of course, we've all read the stories that many corporations cut their taxes or maybe even eliminate their federal taxes due to loopholes, et cetera. But let me ask you this, though. If you were in the state legislature, what would you have done to increase jobs in our state?
Well, right now we have I counted more than 25 programs of various sorts to attract businesses, and if it were up to me, I would take an attitude of no special programs for anybody, but a lower average tax for everyone.
For everyone.
For everyone. So get rid of the special programs, get rid of the corporate income tax. You know, if have a moderate sales tax and income tax, but have it as low as possible to finance needed government services. And needed government services are things like Jim was talking about, roads and highways, and things I was talking about, education, and not be in the business of trying to, you know, convince a factory in New Jersey to relocate to New Mexico. It hurts New Jersey, helps New Mexico, but rather be in the business of having the best darn economic climate we can have to attract businesses to our state.
All right, and we do have another question. Bill Allen from the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Fred. First, Dr. Peach, Dr. Erickson, thanks for doing this again for us. We very much appreciate that. But can you talk about the possible implications of Obamacare on the economy going forward starting in 2014?
Sure, and by the way, there's going to be a forum next week in which there will be a number of experts who talk about that, and in particular the effect of Obamacare on small business. I honestly don't think it's the end of the world. It is not the act that I would have passed. It is too complicated. We have very complicated rules, especially at the low end, where if you, and I'm talking about employers who have fewer than 50 employees, and then there's a category between 25 and 50 where it's ambiguous what the effect will be. We have strange kinds of things where people who are not covered in the act are going to have to estimate their earnings. Say if you were an independent contractor or something, a landscape artist, you'd have to estimate your 2014 earnings. Then there's some tax break on it, and you're supposed to be able to buy it through a healthcare insurance, through a healthcare exchange, which is not yet really functioning in New Mexico. There are going to be all kinds of issues with it. I don't think it is the driving force behind our slow rate of economic growth in this country. What we failed to do with Obamacare in any serious fashion was to address the fact that we're spending 18% of GDP on health care. Doesn't matter who's paying for it, that's an awful lot on health care, especially given what we receive from that. It's more than any other industrial country spends, and our life expectancy is not longer. We're not getting a good bargain for our health care expenditures. At some point, we've got to address those costs and bring those costs down for everyone, whether it's paid for out of the public sector or the private sector, is not the main issue. There are going to be some genuine savings if all or most of the population is covered. You won't have as many people going to the emergency room for minor kinds of things. And emergency room care is very expensive per visit. So that'll be reduced. There are going to be these huge complications, especially for small business, and I don't know, but it's not the driver here.
Okay.
I would agree it's not the driver, but it is a factor. It is not helpful, and particularly small businesses are having difficulty. I think Jim did a good job of articulating that. When it comes to high health care costs, it's interesting that the country that lives the longest, has the longest life expectancy among industrial countries is Japan. They also have the lowest paid health care providers. They pay their doctors less than any other OECD country, except for Mexico. And so we don't have to have high costs to have good health care.
Okay, very interesting discussion on the Affordable Care Act, and that will continue, I'm sure, for some time. We should note that it also includes an expansion of Medicaid, which some predict will reduce dramatically, in some cases, uncompensated care, because New Mexico and Texas have among the highest rates in the country of folks who do not have health insurance. Now, in Texas, the governor there, Rick Perry, has decided not to accept that expansion of Medicaid, but in New Mexico, Medicaid will expand and will cut down to some degree, of course, the nearly one in four people who do not have health insurance in the state of New Mexico. Another audience question now.
My question is, you've mentioned that we have a lot of slack in the economy. I take that to mean there's capability of producing more, but we're not producing it because no one wants it. And as a result, there are all sorts of people who are unemployed. Is there any way to address that? Because it sounds to me like we may have a permanent class of unemployable people who, for whatever reason, nobody wants to buy anything, so therefore nobody wants to build anything. Nobody wants to build anything, so they don't want to hire. Nobody wants to hire, so nobody gets hired, and we run into this cycle.
Sure, and what I was talking about in terms of slack, you pointed to really in there. Take the construction industry. We are still down about nationwide about 2 million construction workers from where we were in 2007. 2 million construction workers. We're down about 17,000 construction workers in the state of New Mexico. And what do we have to have there? We have to have building going on in order to put those people back to work. We've also had productivity increases. The automobile industry will produce about as many automobiles this year as they did in '06 with 200,000 fewer workers. That's a good thing in terms of productivity increases. It's a bad thing in terms of employment. But the solution here is we are lacking, it is a classic case, we are lacking aggregate demand. And we know how to fix that. The way to fix that as a society is government spending, and not the tiny little stimulus program that we had in 2009 that was stretched over a 3-year period that was mainly devoted to tax increases and some grants for education and stuff like that. Out of the $787 billion, only about $250 billion of that was for spending on bricks and mortar, on roads and streets.
Dr. Peach, I've got to stop you here, though.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no political will for increased spending. Definitely not what you're describing, going beyond nearly $1 trillion that was spent in the stimulus. So, in absence of that kind of spending, what do you do? I mean, Dr. Erickson talked about one idea in terms of cutting taxes, but not doing it for one group or another, but kind of across the board. If not that, what else?
I'll tell you what we do. We have a permanent, long-run rate of growth of real GDP that is less than the long-run trend. We grow at 2% instead of 3.3% indefinitely unless we do something to kick-start this economy. And it is, the recession itself was a policy decision. The slow growth of the economy is also a policy decision. These were not natural calamities. We didn't have an earthquake that destroyed our ability to produce, destroyed our infrastructure. We didn't have a hurricane.
But I mean, I think
or a nuclear attack.
Businesses are
reacting. What we had was policy, and we know the policies that will get us out of it.
Businesses are reacting, though, as well. I mean, I saw a figure this week that was really surprising to me. And it said that this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it said since 2006, the number of involuntary part-time workers, that is, folks who want to work full-time but only have a part-time job, since 2006, that number has doubled. So folks don't show up in the unemployment figures. They're working, but they're only working part-time. They're not working full-time. How do we change that?
By boosting aggregate demand. The unemployment figures you cite, the one that you hear on TV all the time, and we're now about 7.6%, that's 11.7 million people who are unemployed. People who are unemployed but are actively looking for work. There are another 7.5 million people in the category that you described of people who are working part-time, and when they are surveyed, say they would prefer to work full-time. They were working part-time for economic reasons. That's nearly 20 million people in this country who are either unemployed or underemployed.
Right.
Okay, that's a policy decision. That's not some fact of nature. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Okay, Dr. Erickson.
Well,
I'm not quite as convinced as Jim is that this won't correct itself on its own. There's a natural tendency of the economy to correct itself on its own. But what is true is that we can recover more quickly if we follow reasonable policies. A reasonable policy is not sequestering. It's not cutting back on the government spending that Jim is arguing is something we need. And I agree with Jim that this austerity spending around the world has not been working. Europe is in recession because of it. What I would do, though, is I would certainly not cut government spending, and my preference in my heart of hearts is to increase government spending if I could, like Jim is recommending. And then when interest rates begin to rise, which they will as the economy recovers, I would shift from fiscal policy to monetary policy, shrink the government back down, use monetary policy to push the economy forward. It won't work now because we're already at zero interest rates. But when interest rates begin to rise, we can use the Fed to bring them back down and reduce government spending. Now, will this kind of policy work? And that would get us back to a balanced budget eventually. Would this kind of policy work? I have to tell you, this is exactly what Bill Clinton did. This is exactly how Bill Clinton took an economy that was weak, spent money, interest rates began to rise as the economy recovered. He used monetary policy to bring those interest rates down at the same time cutting government spending, got us to a balanced budget. I would, that's why Bill Clinton is my favorite president of all time. Not the most moral president, but he's my favorite president. I shouldn't say that.
Boy, we need another hour now. Let's go back to the audience questions and save ourselves. All right.
And the one point before Professor Atkinson asks this question, there is no natural tendency of the economy.
Okay.
But we'll debate that another time.
That's another hour-long show.
Well, since we're talking about natural tendencies and history and last century's growth rate and this century's growth rate, I'd like to ask a more general question, actually two parts. First part is, looking through history, you could argue that the 20th century was an anomaly and that taking a longer perspective, the growth rates of the 20th century were in fact historically high. We didn't really measure it too much before the 20th century, so it's hard to call. And so if we're setting our standard as the growth rate in 20th century, are we setting ourselves up for failure, setting a standard we simply can't achieve long term? And then the other part of that is the policy issue. We tend to look at growth and measure our success by growth, growth of GDP, real GDP particularly, and judge whether we're beautiful, whether we're doing well, whether we're smart by how economic growth is going. And given that there are other issues, environmental issues perhaps, that suggest that pursuit of growth has impacts that we may not like, is there some other way besides growth in real GDP that we could use to measure our success?
Well, we had one at the beginning of the show, and of course that is the distribution of that growth. Lately, the distribution is all gone to the top in the United States of America. Who wants to start with this? This is very interesting, this question, in this first part of the question. Are we measuring ourselves against an unrealistic stick here? Yeah. The 20th century, is that a bad comparison?
Well, no. And I would argue that we are not at the end of growth. I think that there is an important issue about income distribution. There's an important issue about how much of growth is diverted into improving environmental quality. I think environmental quality, global warming is a crucial issue that needs to be dealt with, but not growing is not the way to deal with it. Growth is the way to deal with it. One of the things I'm afraid of is that technological progress going forward is going to more and more favor those who are well educated and those who already own capital, already are the shareholders in corporations, and that benefit will not trickle down to blue-collar workers and other less skilled workers. And it is in fact that technology is replacing those kind of workers. And I think as time goes on, technology will begin to replace more technically skilled workers. Already there are programs that are better able to go through legal cases looking for precedent than can lawyers. It's more accurate, does a better job. And so we're going to start, as time goes on, we're going to start replacing even the more technical workers, And I'm afraid we're going to have to come up with some sort of solution to more evenly distribute the way the economy is done. But I don't think that going against growth is going to be the solution. And that GDP is probably as good a way to measure economic progress as any one number, not the only number, but any one number.
Dr. Peach?
Well, I certainly don't think that the 20th century was something that can't be repeated. It can be repeated in the United States. It can be repeated in almost any country. We have never produced at the capacity of the economy, not even during World War II when we were trying to produce a lot of war goods. We could have produced much more. In fact, we backed off in World War II in 1944, a year and a half before the war ended in terms of production, because we'd already produced all the Jeeps and stuff that we knew we would need to terminate the war. We could have another century like that. China has been growing at very rapid rates for 25 or 30 years now. Japan grew at very rapid rates from about 1950 until about 1990. Japan messed up the policy kinds of stuff. They're no longer growing. I think we can not only grow, but that we can grow in a much cleaner, environmentally safe fashion. And in fact, the kinds of investments that we need to make in environmental stuff could drive that growth if we're only willing to do it.
You mentioned other countries, and I mean, I guess that's where my follow-up question was going to come in on this. When you look at a comparison to the 20th century, I mean, in this century, we're dealing with a lot more competition, global competition, and in the case of, you mentioned China, I mean, the labor rates aren't even close. And in terms of white-collar jobs, you talked about, you know, technology affecting that. We also have, with white-collar jobs, a lot of work that can be done in India via computer. So we also have that aspect of it.
But this is not a zero-sum game. The growth rate of the United States does not have to mean a high growth rate in the United States, does not have to mean low growth rates elsewhere. In fact, the success of many nations around the world could be attributed to U.S. policy after World War II. It was our deliberate purpose to get first Europe after World War II back on its feet and growing again. We wanted the Japanese economy to grow. We wanted the Asian tigers to grow. We wanted India to grow. And you can look at that as success of U.S. policy. We import a lot of cars and a lot of electronic stuff from Korea now, but it was part of U.S. policy to help Korea, South Korea, establish itself as a growth machine.
So to make this work for the United States, are you saying then that we need a lot more companies like Apple, innovators, where we have jobs here on the software, on developing certain technologies, and maybe the material is made in another country? This is what happened, of course, with Apple. That a lot of the technology is assembled in other countries, but a lot of that innovation occurred here.
You know, what we need are the things that I listed earlier: the most highly educated and healthy workforce in the world. That's what we need. We need to invest in our transportation infrastructure. We've built maybe 2 airports in the last 40 years, Denver International, and I can't think of the second one. We have an interstate highway system where we have 75,000 bridges that are substandard in this country. We have a pretty good rail freight system, virtually nothing on the passenger side. We need to spend the money to have, once again, the best and most efficient transportation system in the world, and that was always a public-private partnership. We need to invest in research and development, and we have reduced dramatically the amount of money going into R&D, both in the public sector, which stimulates private sector stuff. R&D stuff, which is inherently risky, big R&D things can't be undertaken by a corporation. It's too risky. Not basic research. It just can't be done. most of it will not produce marketable products.
And of course, Dr. Erickson, this has a big effect on our local economy because
absolutely.
a lot
And
of
if we don't-
research is funded by federal grants
Absolutely.
at New Mexico State
But
University, UNM.
Yeah, well, and we are seeing a decline in federal funding for research at public universities in general, and MSU in particular. We've already had some programs shut down. We had some people who've lost their jobs who are soft money people, not state funded people, people funded from grants and from the federal government. And I had to agree with Jim that research and development is the key to economic growth. It's the key to a clean environment. It's the key to to longer lives and better quality of life for people. And it is also almost definitional that basic research cannot be done by the private sector because it is not profitable. It is something that benefits society as a whole, but it's not profitable. I always give this example. If you look at the theory of relativity, time dilation, the fact that as you go faster towards the speed of light, time slows down. To the best of my knowledge, no one's ever corrected me. The first commercial application of that was of GPS systems, 60 years after Einstein developed the concept. And so that kind of basic research, businesses cannot wait 60 years for an application to generate profits.
And it works in New Mexico too. We're not going to attract high-tech firms, internationally oriented firms, by lowering the corporate income tax rate. We're not going to attract those firms by offering them high school dropouts as a labor force.
Absolutely.
It just doesn't work.
Nope.
So let's do the things that we know work. And marginal tax rates, oh, come on. You know, Bill Gates made a fortune under very high marginal personal tax rates and even higher corporate tax rates in the 90s. And I don't think he worked a day longer or harder scratching his head thinking, oh, I'd work harder if I just had a lower marginal tax rate. This is a preposterous notion.
Dr. Peach, you get the last word. It started, I think one word you used was silliness at the beginning, and we end with preposterous. Thanks so much to both of you. It was a lively discussion today, and we hope to have another one in the next quarter. I'm Fred Martino. Thank you so much for joining us. Local in-depth programming is only possible with your support. You can become a member online at krwg.org. Have a great week.